Good morning. If everyone can hear me, if someone would just type in the chat just to let me know that the audio is good. All right, perfect. We'll get started in just a moment, so just hang on. If you cannot hear me, or do not have any sound, the best option would be to call in via the phone, and we'll also send a message. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Bobby Remus with MCCA, and I'll be facilitating this morning's webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, I have some housekeeping items I would like to quickly review. If you wish to ask a question, please type it in the chat box on the left-hand side. Our presenter will take questions at the end of the presentation. We are also recording today's presentation and will have it available via the MCCA digital repository, our members-only library, for your viewing pleasure and on demand. At the end of the week, you will also receive an email containing a direct link to the webcast and the slide deck. Finally, if you are viewing today's webinar in a group, we ask that you please submit photos of your group and tag us on social media using the hashtag MCCAWebinar. All right, so without further ado, I would like to welcome our presenter, Alexandra Rankin. She is the Interim Director of Health Policy for the Missouri Foundation for Health. She serves as the Foundation's main point of contact for lawmakers and government agencies. Her role focuses heavily on engaging and educating policymakers on various topics relating to the health and well-being of Missourians. She is charged with connecting decision makers to the Foundation's resources and partners working to improve their communities across the state. She has also been tasked as the project lead for the Foundation's 2020 Census efforts. So without further ado, Alexandra, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you joining to learn more about the 2020 Census, and I hope that this webinar will be beneficial. As Bobby mentioned, what I'm going to do is take most of the questions at the end, but if you do have clarifying questions on the slide deck itself, so if there's something confusing on the slide, you can ask during that slide so it doesn't slip your mind. So with that, we're going to dive right in. As he said, my name's Alex. I'm the Interim Director of Health Policy for MFH, and we got involved in the 2020 census work in late 2018, and since then have just been we just hit the ground running, trying to coordinate across all sorts of sectors and partners across the state of Missouri, which has been honestly very fun for me personally. I think for us, we understood that the 2020 census creates such a huge impact for Missouri, and we really, as a state, have so much to gain in terms of resources for our communities. And so I'm going to go through that a bit. I am going to start out on some of the basics, and I know that some of the basics may be review for some of the folks on the webinar, but that way everyone just sort of has the same information to start with, and then I'll start getting into the nitty-gritty that I think might be helpful for your institutions. So to start us off, first, who is counted? The census counts all persons who live in the United States regardless of citizenship or immigration status. I want to emphasize that there will not be a citizenship question on the 2020 census. I know this was an issue that we've kind of heard about over the last 9 months, and there's still a lot of confusion about this because generally, if people heard about the census, they were hearing about it with this particular situation. So it's important for everyone to know and to reiterate to all audiences that there will not be a citizenship question. So people are counted at their usual place of residence, which is where they, live and sleep most of the time. And that does mean that college students living away from home at their either college residence or in off-campus housing should be counted where they are on April 1. They should not be counted, back where they're from. So I went to school in Ohio, and I am from Maryland. I was always in Ohio on April 1, and so I should have been counted as part of Ohio, not as part of Maryland. So why should the census matter not only to you, because I'm sure that all of you in your institutions understand the benefit, but also to the students and partners and communities that you work with day in and day out? So there's 3 big reasons. First, the 2020 census determines our distribution of federal resources for hundreds of federal spending programs. So that's, dollars that we get that are based on this count. And I'll talk a little bit about what those dollars go to, but they go to a lot of safety net programs, including a lot of programs around education. But then they also go to things like funding for roads and bridges and infrastructure, because they base those estimates off of the population. Second, it's how congressional seats are decided, which also goes to our number of votes in the Electoral College. And then lastly, it is our most accurate data for strategic decision making. And that's, funders like us, we rely on it. Groups trying to seek grant funding, whether from us, from the state, or from federal government, rely on it. All levels of government rely on census data, and businesses really rely on census data. That's a little known fact that most people think, oh, well, big businesses, they buy, these third-party data sets, and that's true, but they use the census data to then provide a benchmark for that information and verify. And this is really crucial to talk about, especially across some of our smaller communities where economic development is such a huge part of the work that they do, trying to get more businesses in the town so they can get more revenue for their local government. So just wanted to hit on that a bit. So the 2020 census is unique. There are some new, I should really rephrase this to say new opportunities instead of challenges. But in some ways, we do have to look at these as potential challenges that we have to work around. So the first is that the 2020 census is the first high-tech census, which means that it will be the first time that the Census Bureau will be asking people to respond online and will, in fact, be trying to push people to respond online. It is 2020. It does make sense to do that, but I think there are some considerations to be made for the folks that may not have their own access to broadband or infrastructure or technology infrastructure. You can respond still via a mail form. It's just usually later in the timeline, and I will talk about the timeline and how that works. And then for the first time, there is a call-in number. So they haven't had this before, but now there will be call-in numbers in, I believe, about 14 languages where you can go and actually respond over the phone. Another challenge is in 2020, there are 200,000 fewer canvassers or field staff from the Census Bureau than there were in 2010. And some of that relates to the new operations and the fact that it's focusing more on high tech. But I think it is really crucial to think about, okay, well, if there is more limited outreach, how are we as community leaders and members trying to facilitate some of the awareness building? Because in a lot of ways, we're going to have to be more efficient to be effective. And then finally, basically, as soon as one census ends, honestly, a little before then, there's planning for the next decennial census. And so it's really a 10-year process, and at different milestones along that decade, there are, funding allocations made and decisions made to help plan for the next census. And along the past decade, there have been several hiccups that have delayed funding for the Census Bureau, and even some decreases in funding for the Census Bureau. And really what that translates to is changes in operations and differences in how we can do some of the planning to set up for the 2020 census. One example of this is the Census Bureau was supposed to do about 4 different site tests of the online platform in different kinds of geographical areas, including rural, suburban, urban, and native tribal lands. And they were only able to complete one of those because of funding issues. And that was in Providence, Rhode Island, as their urban market. So there have been some hiccups along the way, but I do think that if we all sort of work from the same guidebook, we can effectively work through these issues. So in Missouri, we do have communities that are historically undercounted and may be hard to count in 2020. In 2010, about 9% of our population was harder to count and had lower than average self-response rates. So that means that we had to employ other resources, and the Census Bureau had to employ other resources to get those folks counted, which inevitably leads to issues with, accuracy and missing folks. Generally, those communities that are historically undercounted are low-income communities, rural communities, renters, or people in multifamily housing. That is mostly because the census is an operation where it's done by household. And so when a population is more transient, they're just harder to reach. Communities of color, people with limited English proficiency, and I should add, it's not on here, but immigrant populations as well, people with disabilities, children under 5. So in 2010, we missed out on around 1 million kids nationwide. And I think most of that is just due to confusion over who gets counted. We count even the smallest ones. And so trying to clarify some of that. Homeless individuals and older adults are also historically undercounted. And you can see this map here. I know it's small, but if you just Google Census Hard to Count map, there is an interactive map that is developed by a university in New York. And you can drill down not just by state, but by county and even census tract to see, okay, how did we do in 2010? What are areas that we might need to work on? What does the enumeration look like for those areas? It's really very helpful and also has a breakdown of demographics for those different areas. So just briefly, the impact on Missouri is pretty substantial. In fiscal year 2016, Missouri received $16.5 billion for the 55 largest federal spending programs where those estimates were derived from decennial census data. So that's a huge number, and that's only 55 of the largest programs. To remind you, the decennial census goes to the distribution of dollars for hundreds of federal spending programs. It was estimated that for every person we failed to count, and that's every adult and every child that we failed to count in 2010, we missed out on around $1,300 per person per year. And so when you think about this has impacts for a decade, we're really talking about $13,000 per person over that timeline. I know this is a small graphic. We use this graphic a lot to show some of what that $16.5 billion is going towards, so what census means for our community in terms of these program dollars. So we highlight things like Medicaid, food stamps, housing vouchers, almost $1 billion for highway planning and construction. So, I mean, in Missouri, I don't know anyone in any corner of the state that doesn't have something to say about our roads and bridges, and I think we all would benefit from drawing down on every dollar that we can for our communities. I did want to highlight a couple of different things. So there are impacts that were highlighted for programs that affect students. So things around federal student loans, federal research grants, campus funding and improvements, and then, the health and social service dollars, that kind of goes towards the last image that I showed you, that graphic. I know many of you have students and community members that probably rely on some of these social supports that are funded based on census counts. And so we want to make sure that we're not spreading our dollars super thin, but we're drawing down on what we need to best serve our population. So now we're going to transition a bit into some of the nitty-gritty details, and I know that this may be an area of particular interest for folks on the webinar. So the timeline. So self-response, which is the process where the Census Bureau sends information to households for them to respond, goes from mid-March to April 30th. It's supposed to start the week of March 12th. We are saying mid-March generally just because, if someone doesn't get it right on March 12th, we don't want them to be concerned. What you see on the right-hand side of the slide is that what the Census Bureau will do for the normal self-response phase is they will send an invitation, so a packet of instructions to households that give them information on how they can respond online or by phone. And then the household will continue to get reminder letters over that period of time. And if on, if by the fourth mailing they have not self-responded, the Census Bureau will send a paper questionnaire. But most households will not receive a paper questionnaire up front. Non-response follow-up then starts from May to July, and that is when the Census Bureau staff go from door to door and try to collect information from those households that did not respond on their own. There are separate processes for group quarters, and I will dig into the process for college and university group quarters a bit more. But group quarters is sort of split into two sections. So the first section is service-based enumeration as part of group quarters, and that's things like soup kitchens and shelters. That starts earlier, and that is to coordinate with a homeless count that happens at the end of March and 1st of April over a few days, where folks go to campsites where have high saturations of homeless populations are. The rest of group quarters, though, happens from April to June, and that is when the counts for college students and universities occur. And then the aggregate information is delivered to the President of the United States by December 31st of 2020. It's important to understand that this is aggregate information, so think state-based information. There is no individual census information that can be shared outside of the Census Bureau itself. It can't be shared with the President, and it can't be shared with any other agency in the federal government. That individual response information is protected. So a bit more about counting college students. So there's two different ways depending on sort of where the student is living. If a student is living in college or university-run housing, such as dorms or residence halls, whether it's on or off campus, they're counted as part of the group quarters. So the Census Bureau will work with college administrators, and it'll usually be the Census Bureau staff from the area census office. and they'll work together to determine what's the appropriate enumeration method for those students. Generally, there is no self-response for students that looks like the self-response in households. So there's basically 3 ways that administrators can choose to count the students. First, they can choose to do an electronic data transfer of the students that were living in those quarters as of April 1, and they transfer that information directly to the Census Bureau. But again, even though they're counting the folks as of April 1, the count itself, the transfer of information may not happen until May or June. There's also the option to do a paper data transfer that is probably not going to be used very often just because the electronic data transfer is available. And then the last is administrators do have the option to do a distribution or a collection of individual census questionnaires to all the students in that group quarter, but it's a different questionnaire for them than what a household may receive. So just to kind of sum that group quarters process up for county college students, the administrators will work with the Census Bureau to determine the enumeration method that makes sense. They're going to count the kids or adults or whoever that was part of those in group quarters or living facilities as of April 1, but the timeline for when that's conducted may be after April 1. Now, there's also household enumeration. So there are students, obviously, living off campus, and I think that may be the case for many on the phone. They're the predominant case, I guess. But students living off campus in an apartment house or other independent residence are counted as part of the normal self-response rate. So their household will get a mailer, and they should be responding as part of their household. And so a few more detail on self-response. And again, this is the self-response that is household self-response, not group quarters. The Census Bureau will assign a unique identification number to each household, which is defined by sort of the physical address. One person fills out the form in the household and includes every person that's part of that unit. It doesn't matter if they're related or not. It can be roommates. It can be, someone just crashing on the couch. One person should fill it out and account for those other folks. There are 9 questions on the form, and I will share that in a minute. I have a slide on those 9 questions. And again, most households, about 90%, are just going to be pushed to do it online or on the phone, and won't get a paper questionnaire until later down the line if they fail to respond. The Census Bureau did release the online response page. It is up, but it is not active yet. It won't really be active until I think March 9th. I would recommend that you flag this website, but don't ask people to go there right now, because I think it's a little, they're still trying to work out the kinks over the next few weeks before self-response, so we don't want to flood the site too much. But just know that if you do have materials, you may want to put this on there if it's during self-response for those students that are counted during self-response. So I've gotten this question a lot. What if, someone loses their form? So households can respond to the census online or by telephone without their unique identifier, without that form that was originally sent to their house. What will not occur is that there won't be paper questionnaires where you can just go and grab a paper questionnaire without an ID and fill that out. All the paper questionnaires have a barcode that tie them to specific addresses. I would just put my disclaimer here that I do not work for the Census Bureau and I have no power over this decision whatsoever, but I do understand that there is some frustration on this because, hypothetically, if someone loses their form, it would be easier to distribute a paper form in many instances. But what instead we should do is guide people to the online response website and to the phone number. And again, you use this method when, if the materials were lost or if someone was left off and they really want to include the person that was left off, or if, they maybe haven't received their information yet, but they want to just kind of do it and get it over with. I don't think we want to deter people who want to be proactive and fill it out. So just a little bit about the questions. It's really not the long form. The decennial census is the short form survey that goes out. It is not to be confused with the American Community Survey, which is long and asks a lot of different questions. So the 2020 census asks simple questions that, I think we all can easily share without looking anywhere, and truthfully that we as a society share with all sorts of institutions without blinking an eye. So it asks number of people in the home, the type of home, so whether you own or rent, your telephone number. I will say that in our research that we've conducted in Missouri, the telephone number has been a bit of a sticking issue where folks just don't like that the telephone number is on there. The reason that the telephone number is on there is mostly so that they can call back to verify if there are any questions or discrepancies. So if one of the other, let's say you include your age and date of birth and they don't match, the Census Bureau will try to call you to clarify before they send someone out to go knock on your door and ask the question. And I don't know about you, but I can say I would so much rather have someone call me than just show up at my door. So they ask the telephone number, they ask your name, sex, age and date of birth, whether you're of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, and your race. And then again, if one person answers and then answers a few other questions on behalf of other folks in the household. So if it's me and one other person, I fill it out, I answer the question about the other person and share the relationship with the other person. There is a sample copy of the questionnaire. This little blue link is available. That's where the questionnaire is. You can also just Google it. It's pretty easy to find now. I will say that, as Bobby mentioned, you will get the PDF of this slide deck, and so any links that are included in here, you will receive. Self-response language. So there are several languages that are available for the different response methods, but it's not all languages. And so what will happen is the internet form will be available in 12 languages plus English. The telephone response method will be available in 12 languages plus English. The paper form will only be available in English and bilingual English-Spanish. What the Census Bureau does have is they have these instruction guides for their staff to use, or I think for other people to use where appropriate, in 59 languages that basically help to guide someone having an interaction with someone that cannot speak English and that may need additional assistance. And the idea is that the Census Bureau, during the non-response follow-up or maybe during some kind of assistance event, will use those guides to facilitate response. There is a list of languages available in that link. What I would say is I would really consider who represents and works with the students and community members that do not speak English as a primary language, and think, okay, well, what kind of resources are we using to maybe have some translation services and to facilitate some of this information. I will say MFH has a few resources that are available in different languages. We have some translations available, but we're relying really heavily on some grantees that work with different populations to do in-person translation and translate materials. Residence situations, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on here, but the Census Bureau has published different residence situations and really helping people understand, okay, how do you count these folks? So thinking of people like visitors or foreign citizens or military who are maybe stationed overseas, or people who live in more than one place, I would suggest that you go to this link, this resident situations link. It is on the Federal Register. Unfortunately, I haven't found a better listing of these situations other than this link, but it goes through these different scenarios so that maybe if you do have a population that fits one of these, it may benefit you to think of, okay, maybe we should create some materials for that. Many of you probably have already been in touch with the Census Bureau at this point. I know I've received a few emails and calls thus far indicating that you have, but if for some reason you have not, I want to make sure you have at least one contact to reach out to. So Missouri is part of the Chicago Regional Office of the U.S. Census Bureau. We have a partnership coordinator for Missouri. His name is Emmett Morris. Emmett is great. He can be reached, his information is on the slide. He has a team of partnership specialists that work in different regions to help with things like trainings, events, provide materials. What I would say is reach out to him if you don't have an existing contact. But also the Census Bureau has asked us to remind folks to please become an official census partner. All you have to do is kind of indicate that, yes, you want to be a census partner, and that just helps them verify that, like, look, you're digging into these resources, you're working to get out the count, and it helps them allocate their time and their resources a bit better if they know that you're a census partner. So questionnaire assistance centers. If any of you worked on the 2010 census, you may recall that there were these sites called questionnaire assistance centers that the Census Bureau had created to help with participation and to answer questions that may arise. In 2020, there is no official designation for off-site questionnaire assistance centers. Any organization can host as a questionnaire assistance center, a QAC. I would recommend that if you are interested in doing an event where you have a questionnaire assistance center or a hub of some sort, you reach out to Emmett. And so he can give you the information that's really required for doing it appropriately, and how you understand how you can facilitate participation without crossing lines. So for example, you shouldn't have staff that's completing the questionnaire for anyone. You should, maintain the understanding that, hey, maybe you can answer a question about the process, but you shouldn't be collecting that information. The Census Bureau will have mobile questionnaire assistance locations and sites that are operated by Census Bureau staff. I don't believe they have made any announcements as to where those are. But what I will say is that as soon as those announcements are made for Missouri, we will do our best to share on our social media platforms and on our census mailing list, which I'll show you in a little bit how to get to that. So considerations. There are a lot of considerations for the 2020 census. So first and foremost, I can say that until I was sort of voluntold that this would be part of my scope of work over the last year and a half through this year, I was not thinking about the 2020 census. I didn't really understand the impact that it had on our communities. I think overall awareness is just really low in communities. It's not a super sexy topic. And we have to find ways to think, how do we make this relate to different groups of people so that they understand that it benefits them, it benefits their community, and it's meaningful. And obviously apathy. Apathy is just always something we have to consider with something like this, because even if you kind of go up and over the moon on all of your awareness activities, there can be folks that are like, why? Why do I care? And I think what's important about that is relying on the right resources to deliver the message to folks. So we are relying really heavily on our community partners, whether they're really small community organizations or big institutions. But thinking about, okay, who are those historically undercounted populations, and who do those populations trust? And who will they listen to? So that's sort of guiding us over the past year and a half, just pretty heavily. Second, trust in government. I mean, this is a survey conducted by the government where you provide your information to the government, to the federal government, no less. And so we just have to understand that regardless of political affiliation and regardless of geography, trust in government is low. And so again, just re-emphasizing that in some cases, yes, maybe the county executive or the mayor or the whoever is the right spokesperson. Sometimes, you know, you also want to rely on the right community leaders and organizations that directly serve people. So just kind of considering that when you're doing any outreach. So we talked about how this starts in technically, you know, like 3 weeks, mid-March through the end of April is self-response. You know, that's tough because we're competing for airtime. So obviously we have primaries coming up, presidential primaries coming up, and that has been flooding a lot of the airtime thus far. So in all of the marketing that's happening, both with our campaign and at the state level, you know, we have to be really strategic about when are we exerting the resources and spending the dollars. It's not going to be much next week or over this next week because, you know, for obvious reasons, we're going to get cut out a lot because of all the primary stuff. Internet access. So this is obviously a big one for this census. 20% of Missouri's population does not have access to broadband or internet services. And even where you may, sometimes technology is a barrier. And so maybe for certain communities, we focus on the phone number. You know, maybe we have to think creatively about keeping computer labs open for longer or employing a few iPads in places where people could just go and respond on those iPads. I will say, I mentioned this before, but there is guidance that was created by the Census Bureau on how to appropriately conduct outreach. And this includes things on, you know, how do you facilitate and assist folks with filling out the form? And also, what are considerations you need to make if you have some kind of event where you're offering technology? That link on there is really helpful, and we've been issuing it to all of our partners who have been doing census work. I did want to make a small note about rural communities. I do think rural communities face multiple barriers. There are obviously barriers with internet access, but there's also barriers with canvassing. So when you think about even when the Census Bureau goes out and has to do non-response follow-up, they can hit a lot more people in a saturated area, you know, in urban and suburban areas. In rural communities, people are more spread out, and so you can't reach as many people in the same time frame. And so, you know, for us, we're thinking about, okay, well, who are the other lead organizations in some of those areas that can help facilitate some of that, not the count itself, but just information so that the Census Bureau doesn't have to count a majority of people in non-response follow-up. And then lastly, P.O. Box usage. So I mentioned that when the Census Bureau reaches out to folks, it reaches out by mail. It only reaches out to residents and households. They do not send information to post office boxes because, you know, hypothetically, you could have a P.O. box in Missouri and live in Colorado. There is nothing tying someone to a household. There is a different process for folks that, you know, have P.O. boxes. They may get the forms dropped off at their house, or they may be part of the enumeration process where the Census Bureau goes immediately and knocks on their door. That being said, I think we should think about, okay, if there are areas where we know a lot of folks rely on P.O. boxes, maybe we can just get them the information on the online link and the phone number so that they can respond without worrying about that and having to wait. So I wanted to give an update about what's going on at the state level because I do think there are some really good resources that are available. So Missouri does have a complete count committee. It was established through Governor Parson. He created it through an executive order back in December of 2018. We have been working really closely with Governor Parson's office and with the State Complete Count Committee, and they've actually adopted our 2020 census campaign and messaging. So it's been a really fruitful relationship, and I think it really helps spread the message. They do have a website. It's census.mo.gov. And on that website, they have different resources, but they also have a new partner mapping tool where you can create a login and then input where you've had some kind of census event. And the idea behind that is so that we can really get an understanding of where are events and awareness building happening, and where are there gaps that we maybe need to get different resources to. I think this really could be helpful across, a radius around a university system or something, because you could see, okay, where was an event held? And maybe there are neighborhoods where we need to hold other events, and we're not currently doing it. Many counties or cities across the state also have local complete count committees. If you're not sure, I would contact the executive branch of that county first, possibly city. And because usually it's established through the executive branch, whether it's the, the mayor or the county executive or whoever, or the planning department of the county. And a lot of those groups have been in place for a while and have, been creating their own plans for outreach. One thing that you all should definitely know about is that they're on the census.mo.gov website, on the state census website, there is a higher education toolkit, which may be really helpful. So that toolkit has just a ton of different resources. It has print materials and graphics, it has timelines and checklists, and it has different kinds of templates and sample emails that I think are really helpful, that you could use and maybe, personalize for your population. So a couple examples. This is a sample planning template that I found on that list of resources, and it's just sort of an idea for maximizing participation. It goes through sort of what are some steps that you can think about to promote awareness and include some census messaging. And as you can see on there, I don't want to read the whole slide to you, but just, finding ways to highlight in digital spaces, whether it's on the events calendar or university webpage, promoting in the right physical locations. There are template messages, so email blasts and newsletter forms, and then shorter messages. They do mention that the official hashtag is #MissouriCounts, and that is part of our campaign. They say you should hear something 7 times before it resonates, so that's the goal here, is just trying to get the message out to folks as many times and consistently as possible. Oh, I skipped a slide. This is just another template that I thought would be useful, thinking about the locations for promoting the census, and then thinking of, okay, well, who's the contact person? What I would say, too, is once you've identified the right contact person at these locations, you should think of what does that person need to be able to answer questions. So, for example, I know we have a frequently asked questions document, and we've been telling folks, why don't you give front desk staff, whether it's at a clinic or wherever, these FAQs so that when it does come around to self-response, they feel equipped to answer some of those questions about the process. And these are some of the sample graphics. I thought they were really helpful, specifically for that higher education population. It does right now direct people to go to the state's census website, so mo.census.gov. What I would say is, as we get into self-response, particularly for the populations, like if you're targeting the populations that's going to respond from their own household, I would consider changing the link to the self-response directly, just to eliminate clicks. We're in the process of doing that with some of our materials, just so people know, okay, if I want to respond, this is exactly where I go. So I've been mentioning this throughout. One of the ways that we invested in this work over the last year and a half is we actually thought, okay, we should create a campaign for Missouri. And we were learning from a lot of other states that had done something similar. We looked at research at a national level that did message testing on different hard-to-count populations, and it was super helpful. But we also noticed that there were some gaps in information in both the Midwest and in rural populations. So we conducted Missouri-specific research, looking in particular too at some of our rural communities and what the knowledge base, the barriers, and who the influencers may be. And we used all of that data to create our messages and our campaign, which is Missouri Counts. And we officially launched in October of 2019. And again, these are the same messages that have been adopted by the State Complete Count Committee and the state's marketing as well. And so we have a ton of different resources and materials. We do have a message guide that helps you with talking points depending on the population you're talking to. So if it's young adults, we have talking points for young adults. If it's, communities of color, we have that. If it's immigrant populations, we have that. We also have a social media toolkit, which of course has the hashtag Missouri Counts hashtag, but it also has just template posts and graphics that you can easily share. I am absolutely terrible with social media. I don't even have my own Twitter, and I can figure it out. So I think it's pretty darn easy. And then we have a bunch of collateral materials and a video available as well. One thing I should mention is we have a very small sort of line item for advertising where we're doing some billboards and some digital advertising. We're also working to generate a lot of earned media. We have an earned media strategy. And then we're working again with the governor's office and the State Complete Count Committee to make sure that we're kind of complementing each other's efforts. So this is the key point. Even though we conducted the research across all sorts of populations, what we found is there was a unifying key point, and that is that the 2020 census is our chance to make sure hard-earned tax dollars that we send to DC come back to us in Missouri. For every adult and every child that is not counted, our state loses $1,300 every year. And when we're all counted, we get more for roads and bridges, hospitals, and schools. Again, you'll see this a lot in our messaging because this was that kind of key point where most people really resonated with that. I did want to highlight the young adults message. I understand that this is not the only population that you serve, but in the message guide, I thought it may be interesting to highlight just one of those groups and the talking points. So understanding that there is a little bit of a civic duty and an excitement of doing it for the first time, making sure people know that they can respond online and do it from your computer or your cell phone. Clarifying, the count for college students was a big one because I think a lot of students think, oh, my parents will get me, and that's really not the case. And then one thing that we did find in research is that this is both with students and then just renters in general is, they're unsure about listing everyone who's in their home because what if one person isn't actually on their lease? So it's important to be clear that like the Census Bureau cannot share information with your landlord, it cannot share information with the housing authority, so you can include everyone in your home, even if they're not really on your lease. For more of our resources, our website for our campaign is mffh.org/census. And on there we have, a lot of the stuff I've been talking about, the message guide, FAQ, social media toolkit, newsletter language and faith bulletins, and just much more. So I would say you can go there to look for different resources. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, whether it's just general questions about the census or if you're struggling to communicate with the right folks or connect with the right folks on issues, I'm happy to try and assist and facilitate. I just had a question yesterday from, an administrator trying to clarify some of the process by how we count students in living quarters. And so, I can try to answer it myself, and if I do not have the answer, I will connect you to someone who does. I'm going to leave my contact information up there, but I am happy to take any questions in the chat box if there are any.
All right, if there aren't any questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up. And in the meantime, feel free to put anything in the chat box or, of course, reach out to Alex. So I had no idea that there were only 9 quick questions on the census, so that I feel like makes it very user-friendly. And I would encourage everyone on this webcast to share this presentation with those in your department or with your supervisor and make it kind of like a lunch and learn. I feel like there's a lot of very valuable information in this presentation that helps clarify some unknowns, and so I think it's very valuable. And so thank you very much, Alex. If you haven't registered for our Student Affairs Seminar, which is on March 4th, you have until this Friday to do so. You can go online to mccatoday.org to do that. Our next webinar will be on March 17th, and we'll provide an overview of the grants that we manage here at MCCA, and more information on that will be coming to your inbox. And so with that, we will go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. And thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.